Alright, this is part 2 of Chapter 1, Stormblessed, and it will begin in just a moment. Here we go. Sen didn't have much choice. The entire army started moving in a clamor of marching boots. As Dowley had predicted, the steady march didn't last long. Some men began yelling, the roar taken up by others. Light Eyes called for them to go, run, fight. The line disintegrated. As soon as that happened, Kaladin's squad broke into a dash, running out into the front at full speed. Sen scrambled to keep up, panicked and terrified. The ground wasn't as smooth as it had seemed, and he nearly tripped on a hidden rock bud, vines withdrawn into its shell. He righted himself and kept going, holding his spear in one hand, his shield clapping against his back. The distant army was in motion as well, their soldiers charging down the field. There was no semblance of a battle formation or a careful line. This wasn't anything like the training had claimed it would be. Sen didn't even know who the enemy was. A landlord was encroaching on Bright Lord Amaram's territory. The land owned, ultimately, by High Prince Sadeas. It was a border skirmish, and Sen thought it was with another Alethi princedom. Why were they fighting each other? Perhaps the king would have to put a stop to it, but he was on the Shattered Plains, seeking vengeance for the murder of King Gavilar 5 years before. The enemy had a lot of archers. Sen's panic climbed to a peak as the first wave of arrows flew into the air. He stumbled again, itching to take out his shield. But Dowley grabbed his arm and yanked him forward. Hundreds of arrows split the sky, dimming the sun. They arced and fell, dropping like sky eels upon their prey. Amaram's soldiers raised shields, but not Kaladin's squad. No shields for them. Sen screamed, and the arrows slammed into the middle ranks of Amaram's army behind him. Sen glanced over his shoulder, still running. The arrows fell behind him. Soldiers screamed, arrows broke against shields. Only a few straggling arrows landed anywhere near the front ranks. "Why?" he yelled at Dowley. "How did you know?"
"They want the arrows to hit where the men are most crowded," the large man replied, "where they'll have the greatest chance of finding a body."
Several other groups in the van left their shields lowered, but most ran awkwardly with their shields angled up to the sky, worried about arrows that wouldn't hit them. That slowed them, and they risked getting trampled by the men behind who were getting hit. Sen itched to raise his shield anyway. It felt so wrong to run without it. The second volley hit, and men screamed in pain. Kaladin's squad barreled toward the enemy soldiers, some of whom were dying to arrows from Amaram's archers. Sen could hear the enemy soldiers bellowing war cries, could make out individual faces. Suddenly, Kaladin's squad pulled to a halt, forming a tight group. They'd reached the small incline that Kaladin and Dowley had chosen earlier. Dowley grabbed Sen and shoved him to the very center of the formation. Kaladin's men lowered spears, pulling out shields as the enemy bore down on them. The charging foe used no careful formation. They didn't keep the ranks of long spears in back and the short spears in front. They all just ran forward, yelling in a frenzy. Sen scrambled to get his shield unlatched from his back. Clashing spears rang in the air as squads engaged one another. A group of enemy spearmen rushed up to Kaladin's squad, perhaps coveting the higher ground. The 36 attackers had some cohesion, though they weren't in as tight a formation as Kaladin's squad was. The enemy seemed determined to make up for it in passion. They bellowed and screamed in fury, rushing Kaladin's line. Kaladin's team held rank, defending Sen as if he were some Light Eyes and they were his honor guard. The two forces met with a crash of metal on wood, shields slamming together. Sen cringed back. It was over in a few eye blinks. The enemy squad pulled back, leaving 2 dead on the stone. Kaladin's team hadn't lost anyone. They held their bristling V formation, though one man stepped back and pulled out a bandage to wrap a thigh wound. The rest of the men closed in to fill the spot. The wounded man was hulking and thick-armed. He cursed, but the wound didn't look bad. He was on his feet in a moment, but didn't return to the place where he had been. Instead, he moved down to one end of the V formation, a more protected spot. The battlefield was chaos. The two armies mingled indistinguishably. Sounds of clanging, crunching, and screaming churned in the air. Many of the squads broke apart, members rushing from one encounter to another. They moved like hunters, groups of 3 or 4 seeking lone individuals, then brutally falling on them. Kaladin's team held its ground, engaging only enemy squads that got too close. Was this what a battle really was? Sen's practice had trained him for long ranks of men, shoulder to shoulder. Not this frenzied intermixing, this brutal pandemonium. Why didn't more hold formation? The real soldiers are all gone, Sen thought. Off fighting in a real battle at the Shattered Plains. No wonder Kaladin wants to get his squad there. Spears flashed on all sides. It was difficult to tell friend from foe, despite the emblems on breastplates and colored paint on shields. The battlefield broke down into hundreds of small groups, like 1,000 different wars happening at the same time. After the first few exchanges, Dale took Sen by the shoulder and placed him in the rank at the very bottom of the V pattern. Sen, however, was worthless. When Kaladin's team engaged enemy squads, all of his training fled him. It took everything he had just to remain there, holding his spear outward and trying to look threatening. For the better part of an hour, Kaladin's squad held their small hill, working as a team, shoulder to shoulder. Kaladin often left his position at the front, rushing this way and that, banging his spear on his shield in a strange rhythm. Those are signals, Sen realized as Kaladin's squad moved from the V-shape into a ring. With the screams of the dying and the thousands of men calling to others, it was nearly impossible to hear a single person's voice. But the sharp clang of the spear against the metal plate on Kaladin's shield was clear. Each time they changed formations, Dale grabbed Sen by the shoulder and steered him. Kaladin's team didn't chase down stragglers. They remained on the defensive. And, while several of the men in Kaladin's team took wounds, none of them fell. Their squad was too intimidating for the smaller groups, and larger enemy units retreated after a few exchanges, seeking easier foes. Eventually something changed. Kaladin turned, watching the tides of the battle with discerning brown eyes. He raised his spear and smacked his shield in a quick rhythm he hadn't used before. Dale grabbed Sen by the arm and pulled him away from the small hill. Why abandon it now? Just then, the larger body of Amaram's force broke, the men scattering. Sen hadn't realized how poorly the battle in this quarter had been going for his side. As Kaladin's team retreated, they passed many wounded and dying, and Sen grew nauseated. Soldiers were sliced open, their insides spilling out. He didn't have time for the horror. The retreat quickly turned into a rout. Dale cursed, and Kaladin beat his shield again. The squad changed direction, heading eastward. There, Sen saw, a larger group of Amaram's soldiers was holding. But the enemy had seen the ranks break, and that made them bold. They rushed forward in clusters, like wild axe hounds hunting stray hogs. Before Kaladin's team was halfway across the field of dead and dying, a large group of enemy soldiers intercepted them. Kaladin reluctantly banged his shield. His squad slowed. Sen felt his heart begin to thump faster and faster. Nearby, a squad of Amaram's soldiers were consumed. Men stumbled and fell, screaming, trying to get away. The enemies used their spears like skewers, killing men on the ground like cremlings. Kaladin's men met the enemy in a crash of spears and shields. Bodies shoved on all sides, and Sen was spun about. In the jumble of friend and foe, dying and killing, Sen grew overwhelmed. So many men running in so many directions. He panicked, scrambling for safety. A group of soldiers nearby wore Alethi uniforms. Kaladin's squad. Sen ran for them, but when some turned toward him, Sen was terrified to realize he didn't recognize them. This wasn't Kaladin's squad, but a small group of unfamiliar soldiers holding an uneven, broken line. Wounded and terrified, they scattered as soon as an enemy squad got close. Sen froze, holding his spear in a sweaty hand. The enemy soldiers charged right for him. His instincts urged him to flee, yet he had seen so many men picked off one at a time. He had to stand. He had to face them. He couldn't run. He yelled, stabbing his spear at the lead soldier. The man casually knocked the weapon aside with his shield, then drove his short spear into Sen's thigh. Pain was hot, so hot that the blood squirting out of his leg felt cold by comparison. Sen gasped. Alright, and that's going to be the end of Part 2 of Chapter 1, Stormblessed. Part 3, there'll be a link right on the page. Check it on out right after to see what happens to Sen and what happens to the whole group of people. Alright, well, see you then.